Getting there, Chris. Getting there. What's up, people? It's another episode of the Talkin TV podcast. We're back. Dom, the movie nerd. Chris, the TV nerd. Chris, what's going on, dude? How you doing this fine Monday night?
I'm doing all right, man. I'm excited to talk about something I grew up with, as I'm sure you did too.
Yeah, definitely. Before we get started, I just wanted to point out that I'm really glad that we're just recording live on Mondays, because I will tell you, one of the kind of most subtle, low-key, annoying things that any podcaster has to deal with is the fact of when you're recording something, you're pre-recording something, but you have to remember that you're talking as if it goes up on that day, on the day that it's going up. And then but then you still just talk about the day that it's on because you're so preconditioned to. So just going live just makes that so much easier. And it seems to be working out very well for the channel too.
Yeah. The YouTube channel is, I mean, I don't want to say blowing up, but there's a lot of kindness being put forth towards it. So
we hit six more subscribers in a day. That's
True.
nothing to shrug off. Those are those YouTube macro numbers is what those are.
That is, yeah. I guess I'm just in shock. Yeah, I guess so, man. I just it's a lot to take in, but it's a good thing to take in, I suppose. And it's incentive for those audio listeners who we do love you guys and we do appreciate you. But I mean, it's time we got to get to know each other a little better. So if you want to have the feeling of, hey, it's live while it's happening, come join the community. Honestly, it's a community now on YouTube. It
really is at this point. We've got we've got the town pastor and all the different contributors, all the different. I don't know where I'm getting the American Revolution comparisons from. I haven't watched The Village recently, but Chris, you mentioned something up top. It's funny because this obviously just our schedule for the next couple of months has undergone a lot of changes just recently. And I think that what we were supposed to do for this week's slot has changed 4 or 5 times in the last week alone. I felt bad because I kept having to call you and be like, Chris, we should do this. And then I felt like a day later, I'd be like, hey, Chris, we should do that. You were just so cool along the way. And we're like, yeah, sure, we can do that. Yeah, sure, we can do that. But I mean, what I found out, and this really should be on me, because the fact that I didn't know that I don't remember if it was yesterday, today, or 2 days from now. I've heard 3 different reports, and for all I know, they could all be true. But this week, just in general, I'm calling it, is the 25-year anniversary for one of, I don't know about you, but definitely for me, one of my favorite movies of all time. A movie that's very near and dear to my heart. A movie that I watched incessantly as a little kid and still watch now because it's a perfect movie. Literally a perfect movie. I'm actually going to bring up points later on to back up the reason why it is of all the movies that I say are perfect, from a hyperbolic standpoint, this one actually is. It's Toy Story. Toy Story is 25 years old, people. 95. What the fuck? When did that happen?
That is absurd, man. And it's bittersweet because we're all getting older is what it means. Yeah. But I still get so much from this movie every time I watch it.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I think that as far as, I've made my love of animation no secret in general, but it's funny because I think that as far as Pixar content goes, I think we've only covered that one other time, I should say, on this podcast. Ironically enough, it was the last episode that we released pre-lockdown because the following week we went into lockdown. But
oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. I still remember that. It was actually, that was when we first had Colin on. It was our first guest, was the Onward episode. But
true.
So you made your thoughts just on animated movies in general. So I wanted you to talk about that a bit before we hopped into the main topic of conversation, because I think it's safe to say that you and I have very, very different relationships when it comes to animated movies. So I just wanted you to kind of talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I love animation, but normally it has ninjas and chakras and,
specifically for one form of anime there.
That's my preferred type of anime, although recently I've been getting into a little bit more of the slice of life on if no one's around on a Friday afternoon and you just want a little chill action, toss on some Your Lie in April. Oh, that became real heartbreaking real fast. But that's normally the, I guess, side of the aisle I fall from in regards to animation. But I obviously grew up with Toy Story, Monsters, Inc., even Ratatouille a little later on. I remember that being a big hit and liking it.
Yeah,
so
that would have been end of middle school, beginning of high school for you, right? Because that was what? That was summer of 07. So
yeah, I had a little sister and little cousins though. So I've seen them, every now and then. They kept me up to date rather. My youngest cousin being born in 2001, and the families are close. So I used to see those things a lot. But I certainly grew out of it as I got to the teenage years, but there's always a fondness, especially with this film in specific, attached to Pixar, especially for me.
Yeah, Pixar is definitely that situation where they could churn out a million duds and I'll still go and watch them. They were just such a staple of my childhood growing up. I watched Toy Story and even Bug's Life, which to me is still the most underrated movie they've ever made because it's better than most of the movies they've made this past decade, were huge staples of my childhood. I remember watching Toy Story 2 incessantly. The problem is Toy Story 2 had the infamous, this is going back in the day, bro, infamous, oh my God, infamous scratch DVD. And that provided troubles galore. And it's so weird how it's so weird because like a Pixar movie seems to fit itself into like every big minute of my life. My grandpa was obsessed with Monsters Inc., so we would go and watch that every minute with him. Finding Nemo, I remember vividly, is the first movie I remember watching in theaters. Incredibles, there's this great story behind it because for whatever reason, my parents, that was the one Pixar movie that I desperately wanted to see in theaters, and we just never got a chance to see it. But I remember I watched like a bootleg DVD of it later on, and oh man, that was probably the most watched bootleg DVD I ever owned. And then same with Cars. And then as we get into like the later 2000s, like the Ratatouille to Up era, I miss all three of those movies. Actually, that's not true. Wall-E I saw in theaters. Ratatouille and Up I missed. I saw those movies later on. I think that's why those two movies in particular don't have the same type of impact on me as like that first run, that 95 to 06 run that Pixar had. And then I watched Toy Story 3 at 13 years old in the drive-in after having grown up with the first Toy Story. And needless to say, I was the market audience for that movie. And there's a reason why that movie also just solidified why the Toy Story trilogy is a perfect trilogy. And it just made me really sad because it felt like a majority of movies, with the exception of Inside Out, after that just was lame. Because first off, they went completely to the sequel well. And unlike the Toy Story sequels, which actually like seemed like there was a lot of thought and a lot of care and a lot of interest put into them, they just seem to dry up. We got, in the last decade alone from Pixar, we've gotten 2 Cars sequels, a Monsters Inc. prequel, an incredible sequel that should have been awesome and was a series of Jack sketches over and over again, and a Finding Nemo sequel that also doubled as a spinoff around Dory. The only original movies that we've gotten from them in this past decade are Brave, Inside Out, The Good Dinosaur, and Coco. And the only one that I would even consider and the only one of those to me that is still like of the Pixar of old, like kind of that old school masterclass, is Inside Out. And so that's kind of like why I've always held Pixar on this pedestal, because that actually kind of brings me into my first point that I wanted to bring up about Toy Story, just kind of about Pixar in general, and kind of why they've always set themselves apart, why they seem to have just this gigantic following, how they've always set themselves apart from just other animated movies and just the typical Disney fodder. Like, it's funny because even though they're both owned by Disney, especially now, nobody would have ever thought that nobody would ever think to confuse a Pixar movie with a Disney movie. You know, like they're two very, very separate genres, two very, very different, like just different visual aesthetics. There's just a lot of difference that goes into them overall. And obviously to me, Pixar, I feel like, was the first to, I think the primary thing though is that Pixar was the first to get to this idea that other animated movies really wouldn't hit until later on. And a lot of them still to me missed the boat on this. I think the only other studio that really did this well was DreamWorks, which is that it seems to, it seems to have this meta nature to it, where it's almost like the movies themselves, with the stories that they choose, regardless of the concepts, are self-aware to the fact that they're going to appeal to people at different walks of life. So like, what's the first thing that like I feel like anybody says about any animated movie ever? They watch it as a kid, they love it. They watch it later on as an adult, they're like, oh wow, there's a bunch of adult humor in there that I didn't pick up on, and now it's great, and I can laugh at this in addition to showing it to my child and having them experience kind of the joys that I did. And Pixar was really the first, because I mean, I don't think really, with the exception of maybe the Don Bluth animated movies, which were just like kind of dark and like more like epic fantasy based as opposed to like kind of lighter kiddie fare, these movies really had this interesting kind of way of walking the line between obviously a lot of very obvious kiddie friendly moments. Like I'll be the first person to admit there's a lot of kid stuff in those movies. I just rewatched 2 other Pixar movies in the past recent years. But the biggest thing that a lot of people have always said is that Pixar movies are adult movies that are simply just made and animated. And it's funny because the more and more I think about it, I'm like, how is it that me at 23 can still watch these movies and get not obviously the same level of enjoyment as I did when I was a kid, but still get like close enough to a level where it's like I just have such this crazy different perspective on it that allows me to like obviously pick up on more so of the jokes, but just like kind of the real world like comparisons and everything, see the different allusions to film, because obviously the creators of Pixar and the heads at Pixar are very, very obviously in love with and indebted to a lot of the previous films that came up before them. Like Wall-E is watching a classic 1950s musical. There's references to Jurassic Park and Star Wars galore across all their movies, literally to the point where they have Rex use the exact T-Rex sound effect from Jurassic Park and Toy Story 3. So you've got all that. And so it all originates in 95. Well, technically a little bit before 95 with Toy Story. So I guess this is the part where I go into the origin story, because everything has an origin story, because we love origin stories. It's part of the reason why superhero films are so successful, because they use this same type of story model for so long. Chris, here I have a little bit of trivia for you before I go into this. What major motion company do you think that Pixar originally started off as a part of?
If I'm just going to take a guess, Warner Brothers?
Surprisingly enough, no.
Okay.
And it's funny because that actually kind of ties into kind of our second unofficial secondary Star Wars month that we've been doing this entire month, because it's
Really?
Lucasfilm.
All right.
It's Lucasfilm.
Really?
It started out in the graphics department of Lucasfilm.
Okay.
I
would never have guessed that.
Yeah, they were kind of like this little offset they were kind of like this little offset section. That's why actually where Ben Burt, who did all of the sound design for Wall-E, obviously was the original sound designer on Star Wars. So right there's the connection.
That's awesome. Wow.
Yeah, they actually branched off in 1986 with actual funding with one Steve Jobs. So at one point, Pixar was a part of Lucasfilm and then Apple, which is just awesome on so many different levels. And I'm crazy. Like, it's so funny because like if you look back at like the early Pixar days, I'm not even talking like early 2000s, which even those still had it, but I'm talking specifically the 95 to 99 rate, which is Toy Story, Bugs Life, and Pixar. And there's just something about that technology, which, again, for even with the massive amount of improvement on animation just in general in the 20 years that it's been since those movies still have impeccable animation. It's just really, really impressive for at the time. There was always a quality to them that like I kind of found very, very familiar as time went on, but could never really place it. And knowing that they had funding from Apple, which obviously was always known for being cutting edge and ahead of the times, is kind of amazing. But also, I'm like, oh, okay, that does make sense after all.
Yeah, when I rewatched this film in preparation for tonight, I was kind of blown away by, Toy Story 3. We recently rewatched that over the summer. And I do agree with your earlier point. Phenomenal trilogy. I'm not going to watch the fourth movie, as suggested by so many of you guys. But not to get too tangential there, I was actually pretty shocked, like with how it held up so well. Like the animation chops were there. It was just a great looking film. Yeah, and it's from 95?
95. Yeah, it's insane. I'll get into like kind of the other points as to like how that changed the game just a little bit. But as far as the Toy Story movies go, you want to know the most sad and depressing and funniest part? Toy Story 4 is as unnecessary as that movie was still better than like every other Pixar sequel that they did this past decade, with the exception, ironically enough, of Toy Story 3. So take that for what you will. So after a lot of trials and tribulations, they did a lot of animated shorts. I'm not too familiar with what they were doing elsewise besides animation, because quite frankly, I don't care, because that's all that I care about with Pixar. They ended up signing a $26 million deal with Disney to produce 3 feature-length animated films using the, at the time, very rudimentary computer animated technology. So basically keep in mind that this is the 90s when CG is not quite to the level that it's there now, but we're still getting like some pretty revolutionary stuff. Like this was the decade where when Toy Story comes out, 2 and 4 years before this movie, you get Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park, which at the time were like mega bombs as far as the level for visual effects work at the time. So this wasn't necessarily playing in the same ballpark as those 2 movies, but it was around the same time. The concept of Toy Story was largely based on the technical limitations, which is interesting considering just how everything about that movie for the most part still really holds up. The design, the detailing, the texturing, detail, something that Pixar would become very crucially known for as time went on. And
not just in Easter eggs though, right? That's not really what you're hinting at there entirely.
No. Well, just references and Easter eggs is part of it, because that's kind of become a part of the larger Pixar canon as time has gone on. But it does also have a lot to do with like just little references and innuendos. Like it's funny because when I was rewatching Monsters Inc. the other night, one of the funniest jokes that I picked up on where I'm like, oh, this shows just how much of these guys are old school film nerds. The sushi restaurant in Monsters Inc. that Mike Wazowski takes Celia to is named Harryhausen's, which I never caught and never would have known before this, named after the great Ray Harryhausen, whose visual effects work goes back decades. If I had his Wikipedia profile pull up right now, I'd be able to tell you all the movies that he's worked on, and I guarantee you would know every single one of them. If I'm not mistaken, I actually think he did some of the visual effects work for Men in Black. But the point being, a lot of creature feature stuff. So, needless to say, just that joke in and of itself was hilarious and fantastic. And there's a bunch of different stuff, like references to their own films, references to other stuff. It's insane, just the amount of stuff they did. And they have accomplished so many different things, so many different genres in the last 20 years alone. But if we're talking about Toy Story, right? Here are just some things that are impressive about Toy Story in general. It's the first full-length animated CG film, obviously, ever made. Like, this type of animation had never been used before. Budgeted at $30 million, made $375 million, obviously. So, needless to say, it was a hit. It obviously kicked off a lot of trends. Pixar, it kind of forced everyone else in the animation industry to move towards CG animation fully, raised the bar overall for animated movies. And this brings it back to kind of that point about being a perfect movie that I brought up before. This movie has 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. 100%. And the reason, it's funny, I was listening to the Rewatchables when they talked about this the other day. And normally, I don't try to pull too much like direct quotes from them, but the one thing that like I do think that Sean Fennessy brought up that was actually really interesting is the idea of kind of old Rotten Tomatoes versus new. Nowadays, it's kind of really tricky to come to an overall consensus on a movie just because the amount of critics that review a movie and the amount of reviews that go into just one movie in order to determine the overall score on Rotten Tomatoes. It's so many and it's so differing and varied that a score can change within like 10 minutes, literally 10 minutes. And so it's not necessarily kind of as legitimate, for lack of a better word, because it's like, okay, everyone's just kind of throwing in their opinion, and this doesn't feel like it has the same weight. But with this movie, this was 95, so obviously just the amount of people who had access to just this type of stuff in general was not the same. Critics, obviously, with what they had access to back in the day beforehand. So this is why I take this stuff really, really seriously. That 92% audience score, though, is a crime against humanity, though. That is the one thing I will say. You people, like, what is your problem? What is your problem just overall? Why do you not enjoy just joy in general?
Can't have nice things.
Just can't. So the other things, some other fun tidbits about this movie. The original treatment for this movie, it was going to pair a one-man band called Tinny, which was previously from another Pixar short, with a ventriloquist dummy named Woody, and send them on a sprawling odyssey. Woody was portrayed as cruel and abusive towards the other toys until they rose up against him. This was a treatment written by original Pixar superstars who also contributed to the film, that being John Lasseter, Pete Docter, and Andrew Stanton. Pete Docter would obviously go on to direct Monsters, Inc., Up, and Inside Out. Andrew Stanton would go on to direct Finding Nemo and WALL-E, among a lot of other Pixar superstars. Like I said, Pixar has kept a lot of its talent mostly in-house for the last 20 years, and with one big exception that I'll get into in a little bit, they really haven't changed up, and it kind of shows overall. This was actually, ironically enough, this treatment was done under Jeffrey Katzenberg, who at the time was working for Disney. Jeffrey Katzenberg was a guy who a lot of people may not recognize that name, but why he is an important figure is because after he left Disney, shortly after this movie was made, he actually ended up founding DreamWorks Animation. And ironically enough, the idea being that some of his storyboards and ideas that he took for A Bug's Life, the reason why Ants and A Bug's Life were compared so much is because he took those storyboards, went over, started his own company under Spielberg's DreamWorks title. Started up the animation department over there, and then made A Bug's Life, and then they also conceived of and made The Prince of Egypt also in the same year. So that's just a little. Yep. So Hollywood is the smallest of worlds. Katzenberg at the time scrapped the idea. He said that he told him to revamp it. I think he said the idea was that kids weren't ready. At least again, just the idea of we'd already sat through a decade of kind of dark fantasy or whatever, but this is Disney and everything. They got a brand name. They got a model that they got to maintain. Which is that, so he told him to scrap it and revamp it, kind of take it into more of a buddy adventure idea, similar to kind of The Odd Couple. He specifically recommended movies like 48 Hours and The Defiant Ones for them to watch. They revamped the whole idea, and needless to say, on this date, or somewhere around this time, November 22nd, 1995, this movie was released, and it was a smash motherfucking hit. So we'll get into a little bit more of kind of just the behind the scenes in general of Pixar later on. But I guess this is the part where, I mean, we just talk about this movie and just like the influence that it had on us. I mean, Chris, you talked about it. And I feel like I've talked enough. So just kind of go into like, what do you remember about like the first time you watched this movie? And like, if obviously, again, it's really tricky just judging from like previous childhood experiences, but like there's always that like little bit of onset emotion that's there. Like there's always a sign, even when you're young, that you recognize that something is different and something is interesting and something is unique. And you're somebody who's talked a lot about kind of just how early on you kind of recognize that good artistic work for what it was. So kind of just like dive into that.
Yeah, so it's funny, like not Toy Story in specific, but some of my first watching memories of going to see films in theaters was my first ever sort of conscious film goer experience was going to see Tarzan in theaters.
Ooh, underrated.
Yeah, and then you know, a little later on in life going to see Monsters Inc. So I'm sure Toy Story was it might not have been an in-theater watch for me. Granted, I was 1 year old at the time, so if it happened, I don't remember it, but I do remember watching it quite heavily and definitely going to see the second one in theaters with the family. And, you know, those movies always had a funny effect of making the parents get a little emotional because, like, it's this little kid ride, but like you said, there's a lot in it for adults. And I think it just sort of stems down to maybe not so much in this current decade that we're in, right? I mean, we've kind of spoke about that ad nauseum, but the quality back then, at least, there was something truly for everyone. And so it was really funny for me to watch this film, you know, now in preparation for this episode and kind of like see Sid. And Sid's an interesting character. Like he's the kid that, like, you know, when you're a little kid and there's like that child on the playground with you who's kind of violent or who wants to, like, you know, play fight at lunch or whatever. If you're a boy, that's things that happen. It's not like weird, but then if you're a parent and you're watching this kid go home and blow stuff up and, you know, just be violent towards toys and inanimate objects, it's a little weird. So it's like, it for the first time didn't feel like innocent fun watching Sid. And so it's like every time I watch this movie, the reason I kind of give you that little insight is I just keep getting something new out of it. So I think when you ask me what my relationship with this movie is, I'd say it's still growing. And I think that is a testament to how strong of a film it really is, you know?
It's really, really just impressive and funny that you say that because again, that's obviously a trend that you see a lot more so nowadays with the idea of just kind of parents enjoying animated kids that are supposed to be for kids. That's still a moniker that I really, really hate. But it's funny to like just thinking that like parents at that time in like the late 90s would just be giggling at this movie that's made for kids because there's so much in this movie. And just like going back to this first movie that you see, like just the way that the characters are talking with each other, you know, kind of the little references and innuendos, like kind of the motions that they have where they've almost got this like kind of set structure. It's almost like already kind of pre-existing world within this world of their own, where they have their kind of their own set of rules and structures as opposed to the kids. It's very well thought out, obviously, first and foremost. And I guess just, I don't know, because obviously there's a lot of jokes that I've noticed in other Disney animated movies that I've seen, but like you really weren't seeing this, you know, like they were like every animated movie that was kind of made before this was like very much to itself and very much like about its own story. And it wasn't necessarily concerned with like, for lack of a better word, audience metrics. It was just concerned with like being a good story overall. And I just find it really fascinating how the studio was able to find that perfect balance between those, where it's like one half perfectly metriced out in order to be able to appeal to everyone versus on the other half still being like this really interesting, awesome buddy road adventure that just happens to be set within this first of many wild concepts that DreamWorks would come up with. You know, it's one of the things that I find endlessly fascinating about them is they take literally these child concepts like Andrew Stanton, Pete Docter, all the other Pixar legends. Now I've talked about kind of the ideas that they came up with, like Monsters Inc. They were literally told by Disney to come up with another idea in order to kind of, after they had already completed their 3-movie contract. And they were like, what about Monsters in the Closet? And when kids had like nightmares about that, and that led to Monsters Inc. And then when Andrew Stanton is talking about Finding Nemo, was like, oh yeah, I would like look at I would always be fascinated by the fish in the dentist's office in the fish tank. Kind of what would happen there, and that led to Finding Nemo and all this different crazy stuff. And then obviously don't even get me started on when they bring in Brad Bird for The Incredibles, because that's just a whole nutshell in and of itself. But
you know, I think you're right when you say before we get too far away from this point, Toy Story certainly was the first of its kind on the big screen, I truly believe, to sort of be conscientious of the fact that, like, there's adults bringing these kids to these movies, you know? How else are they getting there? So let's try and give them something. And if we add that extra layer, as they grow older, like I kind of just described, they'll keep coming back to it for new reasons. But that kind of also happened a little bit, I think, just this is the 90s in general, where kids animation took a next step because Rugrats and Hey Arnold and even, like, you know, all the Nickelodeon early shows really had some like pretty iffy subject matter. Like I remember, probably because I was 4, it's probably not crazy now, but there were definitely certain episodes of Hey Arnold that were quickly turn that off, like in the background, on old tapes and whatnot from growing up. Just because they pushed the envelope a little bit too much, and they were starting to really for the first time. So it's so funny what was happening in the '90s. Just sort of reflecting and thinking back on it, right? In regards to animation and the kids medium, sort of getting a little more risky, and bringing us to where we are today.
It's so funny that you bring that up because that's literally the exact reason why I just wasn't allowed to watch Nickelodeon in general. Meanwhile, I was allowed to watch Cartoon Network.
Okay, so it wasn't just me.
No, it wasn't just you. I promise you, it was not just you. But so that's an interesting kind of point that you bring up, where it's just obviously just cartoons and what cartoons in general were capable of doing, and kind of like how they were advancing the subject matter in the 90s. But that actually kind of brought me back to kind of the central theme of like what Toy Story is about, which I think is why, because they had just such a strong, rock solid foundation, why they were able to kind of take that and bring that to the next level and kind of advance upon different kind of versions, just like kind of these different universal themes that would really allow them to benefit and allow their kind of their wild concepts to be so beloved by so many different generations of people, which is it's kind of a hard sell to pitch to a studio a movie about existentialism, but considering just how well this movie balances out, and you wouldn't think of toys kind of being the perfect voyeur for that, but at the same time, it's like the way that they set these rules up in this movie so well. It's like these toys are specifically designed, their sole purpose in life is to literally playstate human children. And because the idea is that when they when they are having fun, the toys feel the toys feel just some sense of satisfaction, some sense of purpose overall. And obviously the main central conflict of the movie being that Woody who is obviously always been very comfortable in his position of being number one toy, his whole existence and everything he knows is completely upstaged when Buzz Lightyear comes in. The humor and hilarity of that being that Buzz Lightyear is completely has no awareness of the fact that he is an actual toy, which just the jokes that come from that alone are amazing. But it kind of asks a lot of questions that I feel like adults didn't really come to expect from animated movies, right? Because let's talk about just animation in general, right? Because it's a big problem that I've always had. What is it that determines so early on that hand-drawn animation was exclusively for kids? Is it a cartoon thing or was it a Disney thing? Because I feel like it's some combination of the two, because obviously just the origin of cartoons and hand-drawn animation within cinema in general, it was primarily used as kind of shorts that happened before feature-length films. Obviously back in the day when you would like just go to a movie theater in order to get everything, your news, some cartoons, just a lot, and trailers of just all sorts of different
for 5 cents.
Exactly. It's all for 5 cents. So like I don't know, like, do you have anything to weigh in on there as far as that? Because it's always a thing that's really plagued me and intrigued me, obviously.
Yeah, I think it's like starts with sort of, Bugs Bunny and Tom and Jerry, and how it was just so juvenile, the sense of humor. Very slapstick, very, little kid will laugh at a pot falling down on Jerry's head and, Tom getting away or whatever. I forget that. I never liked Tom and Jerry.
Oh, really?
So if I got them mixed up, that makes it better for me personally. But like, I think it stems from that era. I believe. I'm not by any means an animation historian. It's a little more your wheelhouse. But if I had to guess, I think it's just the way it was originally presented to us once the TV set had become a household thing and we had more than 4 channels.
Makes sense.
And that's my best guess.
Well, definitely. Yeah, it's a thing that's always pissed me off because I'm like, obviously I'm a diehard animation fan and I'm just one of those people that just never grew out of his love for animation for whatever reason. Even like even now where I like am fully conscious and recognize of the fact that 90% of the animated fare that I do watch is made specifically for kids. And that will obviously kind of just continue to offer things up that don't necessarily appeal to me per se, but I still have tremendous respect just for the form in general. I don't like it because to me, it's the idea of them being considered kids movies always like kind of discounts them in a way, which kills me because most of the kid stuff that I've seen is way better than a lot of the adult stuff that I've seen. There's a reason why I still go back and watch a lot of the cartoons from when I was younger over and over and over again. But as far as translating that to movies, right? Toy Story, I would argue, is really the first, because obviously you had the Disney Renaissance before then, and the Disney Renaissance was obviously made famous for kind of bringing it back to traditional old school, because after 2 decades where Disney almost filed bankrupt, where Disney Animation came very close to filing bankruptcy, they kind of managed to rejuvenate it, bring it back to like their classical tales about Disney princesses, obviously with Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast. Then they started to get into other fare with Aladdin and Lion King. But then Toy Story hits in 95. And it's tricky because this was weird, because this was when Pixar was still technically its own official thing. Disney was just doing distribution for them. They weren't actually technically bought out by Disney until 2006. Actually 2005, sorry, when Michael Eisner left as CEO and Bob Iger officially started his reign that would later go on to include the acquisition of Marvel and Lucasfilm, obviously, which we all see the effects of that on the current cinema landscape. But
his reign.
But it's so interesting to kind of think about kind of what this ushered in as far as, forget animation, just kind of like what stories we're capable of. It really is, I think, kind of just all these different layers that kind of add and kind of almost give this film's identity a little bit of a raised status than just being like a really, really well-made movie, you know? Which it is. Like, it is still, like, to me, a perfect movie just from start to finish, just from a scripting phase. But kind of all those other things that go into it, it really does kind of give it, like, a little bit of a raised profile.
Yeah, I definitely could see that. I think it was subtle, though. I don't think it's as strong as like now in the modern day you have, for example, like Zootopia, which is saying all sorts of things, and you can watch that movie from almost like not a scholarly scope, but you can really unpack major social commentaries out of that film. So I don't think it's as, how do I put this? I didn't think it came on as strong as maybe we're describing it right now for the sake of analyzing and really giving it the jumping off point. But I think it certainly took the first step to sort of painting a deeper narrative. And I think that's something we've seen sort of Pixar especially, and then DreamWorks, obviously they're in major competition. So they kind of, go back and forth. And so both of them, I think, and just that natural cycle have gotten us to, more recently films like Coco and films like Zootopia, and then just all the different social commentary and Moana, exactly. You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and not to mention just all the other, just forget Pixar and DreamWorks, just what every other animation studio just in general is trying to do. You saw that Sony actually put out, Sony put out Into the Spider-Verse, which again, just that being another incredible animated spin on the superhero genre, just everything that was able to do, that had elements to me that I saw in Pixar. Obviously with Sergio Pablos' Klaus last year on Netflix, just what that film was able to do. Like, Pixar has obviously found a way to Pixar has obviously been incredibly influential just in the animation genre and also in the film genre in general. But you mentioned that word, right? That one word that seems to have everyone has forgotten just in the age of the internet, subtlety, which is that you're right. As good as Zootopia is still kind of going out of its way every couple minutes to remind you that this is a message movie. Toy Story is not. Toy Story does have a message, because to me, every movie has a message. But it's not going out of its way to like smack you in the face with it, which is in the sense of like, it's very good at doing to me what films should do, which is, having the characters, voice the themes through their actions, not their words. So I find that really interesting, just kind of how that transition has happened. And also just like, again, I hate to be like sound like a boomer, but why movies back then were actually, good. But, and just from a scripting phase, I mean, that's the thing. And it's funny is most animated movies, they've got usually a team of like about 3 or 4 writers, but this movie has 7 credited writers. Obviously, Pixar heavyweights, John Lasseter, Pete Docter, and Andrew Stanton, and also Joe Ranft, who still did not direct the movie, but was heavily involved in the behind the scenes of Pixar, and also went on to provide like small voiceovers in future films. Also writing partners Joel Cohen and Alex Sokolow, not Joel Cohen of the Cohen brothers, but famously the Joel Cohen that fooled Bill Murray into doing Garfield, because Bill Murray saw his name and didn't realize that was not Joel Cohen of the Cohen brothers. Also, I would just love to see a Garfield movie directed by Cohen brothers. That is a true story. Look it up.
Was Bill Murray upset?
I think by the time he realized it, he'd already signed the contract, is the problem. So, yeah. One Joss Whedon, who is another guy who is certainly not inspired any controversy nowadays. Not at all. That's a podcast for a different day. But it's called Score was composed by Randy Newman, obviously, and his score and original song "You Got a Friend in Me" is now absolutely iconic. You're a score guy. Talk to me about Randy Newman. He's not a guy that you've, I think, mentioned a lot.
No, and it's because I don't really watch his movies, or at least the Toy Story films, rather, for the music because I, not my type of music. But rewatching this film now for the first time in a very long time, and obviously the best I am at being a musician, the most honed my skills are. It was crazy how like interwoven the score was with the film. It was like not pseudo musical, but it had definitely very musical-esque moments, and without the score, the subtext that was in there might not have truly convened the moment too well to kids. I think it really was a solid aid to get the kids on board with what was happening. If it was a little too fast, right? If it was just a little too much, because like sensory overload can happen at that age and all that. So I thought it was really smart and clever, and it's just so soothing as well, which I think if you're writing a score for a children's film, you don't want to like. That's why there's a whole genre of writing music for kids, right? I mean, music has a psychological effect on people, and especially at a young age, parents have their kids listen to Beethoven in the crib, and studies have shown that makes you a better math student or a better English student, or at least has a positive outcome on your brain because it's challenging your brain to sit there and listen to complex music at a young age. So I was just like wondering if he knew that stuff going into writing for this film and tried to apply it, because it felt really like just you couldn't cut the music away from this film and have it be as successful as it is. It's such a part of the connective tissue. And so while I'm really not too familiar with Randy Newman's catalog, I obviously seen this movie a bunch, and I think it's fascinating. It makes me want to get more into it, but there's still so much I got to get to. But so I was thinking about those types of things, and how I hope there's something there, and I hope that's not me reading too much into it. I hope I stumble upon an interview one day, because if I ever find that out to be true, he's just going to go up like to the top 10 greatest musicians of all time for me.
Well, I mean, that's something that you'll obviously have to do in your further studies and travels in this channel, and just in your own studies. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, for certain things that are coming down the line. But I've talked a lot about Pixar. I've talked a lot about just kind of what this movie accomplished overall, what it set, the precedents that it set up just for the future. So now I just want to talk about this movie. Like, oh man,
Please.
like, but I think the biggest thing to me that hits me every time that I rewatch this movie, this isn't quite that movie that I watch like once a year, but it's definitely that movie where it's like every chance I get, I'm like, oh, I haven't watched Toy Story in a bit. I'm going to go and watch that. It's so interesting. Just the entire Pixar catalog. I'm like, man, I feel like I really need to go and watch those movies again at least once a year, because like every time I watch them, like I just rewatched Monsters Inc. and Ratatouille. They're so special. I get something from them every single time, whether it's a joke I missed, a detail I missed, a little character bit, just another bit of emotional turmoil that just hits me right in the feels. And this movie started it. This movie has all of that. And the most impressive thing being, it's an 82-minute runtime. That's the other thing that I realized, that I look back and I'm like, wow, I forgot these movies are all short. I think the longest Pixar movies are The Incredibles and Ratatouille, and both those movies only clock in at like an hour 50, hour 55 each. Like Toy Story, this movie is 82. It's an hour and 22 minutes, and you've got an already set up pre-existing world and mythos with its own set of rules and structures, a didactic main character who is set up for an emotionally complex set of turmoils, a perfect antagonist. Like Woody and Buzz's relationship is set up immediately. You have Buzz coming in and upstaging kind of the natural order of things. Woody attempting to get rid of him, the betrayal / murder attempt, them going to Pizza Planet, them going to Sid's. And I'm like, all of that is like an hour and 20. I'm like, Jesus, no wonder I was able to watch this so many times as a kid. Like that's the length of like the Battle of Winterfell episode in the last season of Game of Thrones. That's a TV episode now for us. Like that's insane.
Yeah, I wonder if it's just because, this is the first film of its kind, like you said, fully CG animated. I wonder if there was some sort of, constrictions there, or, computers maybe. Could they handle rendering a film any longer than that in 95? But I mean, to be honest with you, there's like no fat on this screenplay at all. But it's like, you also feel so fulfilled by this journey. Voice casts obviously have to be amazing to create great films, but I don't know if I've ever sensed a chemistry like I've sensed between Buzz and Woody in a voice cast. I mean, they just really connected in a weird way, because again, sure, They might record them in the same studio. They might be looking at each other. We don't know that. What we do know is we're watching a little, cowboy doll and a spaceman doll, but yet they literally feel like they're like, when you and I hang out, I can reach out, give you a high five, shake your hand when I see you. Like, it felt organic in a way that I've never really gotten from animated films, even some of the great ones that came after it. I'm talking Finding Nemo, Monsters Inc., even Zootopia, which you can argue that film, it's just a personal love of mine. And so it just kind of like, they just did something like, this is one of those, they call them hotspots in creative history. For example, in England in I believe it's like 64, you had like Clapton, Phil Collins, Zeppelin, all those guys stomping around as local musicians, running into each other at bar gigs before they got big, exchanging ideas, sort of helping to cultivate and grow. It would become like a massive British wave of some of the most influential artists of all time, because they were in the right spot at the right moment, dubbing it a hot spot. And I feel like early Pixar, those creatives, this team, I would call this a hot spot.
Yeah.
Because I just wanted to make sure we talked about that, because it's like, it's one of those things that's felt not seen, considering it's an animated film.
No, we have to. And just ironically enough, considering the fact that the other day I was literally just telling you about the 70s boom and basically confirming like your thought process that was exactly what was happening in the early 70s in the film industry, where with the film brat generation, where there's the first generation of filmmakers that went to film school specifically, they went to college specifically to study film, and they were all kind of going around on the different sets, helping each other out. Obviously, Lucas famously being on the set and offering up ideas for Coppola on some of his early movies that he did before The Godfather, which led to Coppola financing Lucas's first film, and Lucas and Spielberg obviously being best friends, and Coppola and De Palma constantly like going at it back and forth with each other. Like, it's always there. I definitely understand where you're coming from with the hotspot thing. And just as far as the casting goes, you want to talk about a casting hotspot right there, just from the casting standpoint, you're talking Tom Hanks, arguably the biggest movie star on the planet at that point, because just at that point, he just come off of a run that included The Burbs, You've Got Mail, Sleepless in Seattle, A League of Their Own, and then back-to-back Best Actor Oscar wins with Forrest Gump and Philadelphia. And this was all pre That Thing You Do and Saving Private Ryan and Green Mile. And Tim Allen, who is one of, if not the biggest TV star on the planet right now, I feel like it's between him and Jerry Seinfeld
he's like America's dad
for Home Improvement, pretty much. So you got those two just leading the chart. And then the rest of the cast, you've got this impressive lineup of comedians overall. You got Wallace Shawn, who's become infamous for every voiceover role on the planet. Jim Varney of the Ernest franchise. Don Rickles, famous stand-up comedian known for heckling. John Ratzenberger of Cheers fame, who would go on to have a voiceover part in every single Pixar movie. I could probably tell you them for all going up all the way up until Brave, and then after Brave, it starts to get fuzzy for me. Andy Potts from Ghostbusters as Bo Peep. The list goes. R. Lee Ermey from Full Metal Jacket as Sarge. The list goes on and on and on as far as just the casting goes. Like, they knew what they were doing as far as that goes. Now, when it comes to like the humor itself, because that's just another like really underrated part just about Pixar in general, is the movies are really funny. Like, really, really funny. Like, I found myself laughing hard at a lot of the jokes that still go on. Like, I love the part where, remember when they're all standing at the windowsill and they see Sid blowing up the toys outside, and Buzz is like gonna go and jump into action, and like, you can't go down there, and he's just like, they're just like, that's Sid, he's evil, and he's like, what? You mean that happy child?
Yeah, I did enjoy that, dude.
That was great. Just Woody's overall neuroticisms of just everything, and kind of just like how he reacts overall to Buzz's unself-awareness. Like the line when they're under the car and Buzz is like, "I alone contain the one information that is needed to help destroy the space station." And Woody's just like looking at him, and then he's just like, "You are a toy."
Yeah, no, dude. And also it's just like Woody in general, just he really has that second level for the parents, in my opinion, because he's like got weird attachment things. If you read into it, he's very jealous, and he's very, for no reason, just kind of unrelenting in regards to Buzz, and it's just so human, even though he's a toy, how the second he pushes Buzz away, quite literally, he feels immense regret and wants to get him back. And it's like, as little kids, I don't quite know if I really hit the emotional note that I did rewatching it, honestly, earlier today. Like, it was pretty deep for what it was.
It's funny because when I remember I mean, again, this is going back 20 years now, so the details are going to be a little bit fuzzy, but I think obviously my emotional reaction just kind of seeing it over and over again was kind of just funny. It's like just the amount of stuff that's happening in just that one like fraction of a second when Buzz gets knocked out the window is ridiculous in and of itself. So obviously there's just so much happening that my tiny like prepubescent brain is just trying to keep up with stuff. But I think my reaction was just like, oh no, Buzz fell. And then years later, like kind of seeing all the different layers and levels that go into that and kind of being able to chuckle at it while at the same time still feel like, oh, Woody fucked up, you know? It's like all of that goes into that, just that one scene. And Pixar is able to like kind of put that into every single one of their movies as time went on. And obviously, to me, I think, what's my favorite bit? I think it's like when they first fall out of the car and Buzz is first like trying to explain his mission to Woody, and Woody's only reaction is what? Like that's just, it's perfect. It's just so natural. It's so genuine. It's exactly like kind of, I feel like what we would expect. It's so funny because I feel like it's like, again, this is kind of like just, again, how Pixar is amazing at calling the future. I mean, that would be better sort of, I feel like talking about The Incredibles, but just kind of the sense of like, how somebody like from the real world, for lack of a better word, just like a regular person is talking to like one of us who just like, they know about movies, but they just go so exclusively in depth with it to the level where it's like, we're almost like not engaging in the real world now. And they're just like, wait, what are you talking about? And it's like, I get all that just from that one exchange. It's amazing. It's
brilliant. At the same, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm trying not to jerk this movie off too much because I feel like I've already done that. But I mean, it's a perfect movie, and it's one of my top. It's my favorite animated movie of all time. It's in my top 10 best movies ever made. So yeah, I think it's safe to say I have a little bit of a bias towards this.
I mean, it's a 5 out of 5. That's,
yeah. No point. I mean, we don't even need to go into star ratings as far as that goes.
I just wanted to just say, you know.
No, yeah, we better to just get that out of the way now because it's like we don't even
riffing off you. Yeah,
it's yeah, this is a perfect 5. This movie easily. And okay, so there was one other thing that I wanted to talk about, which is kind of just how well this movie sets itself up for future sequels when it arguably never needed them, right? So it's funny because Pixar sequels are something that I feel like myself and a lot of other people have complained about in recent years, but this movie was Toy Story 2, the first Pixar sequel, was the third movie ever made, and it's arguably better than this movie. I mean, it's so funny because like we talk about sequels that are better than the original all the time, but I feel like that's such a subjective term when it comes to this trilogy specifically, because I mean, like, you can talk about Godfather 1 and 2 all the live long day about to what's better. Dark Knight, I think it's pretty safe to say, is objectively better than Batman Begins. The Terminator 1 and 2, Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, Alien and Aliens, a couple other ones that I'm drawing a blank on right now. It's a kind of subjective back and forth that mostly comes down to a standpoint of preference as to which one is better, per se. But just as like how it has a continuing story throughout the subsequent sequels, even to an extent in 4, which I've said before is largely, if not wholly, unnecessary just as a movie in general. But there's still, I think, actually a lot of good stuff in that movie, which is why I give it a lot more credit than some of the other Pixar sequels that we've gotten recently. But I think about Toy Story is that because of its theme of existentialism that it goes for, obviously not just with like kind of knowing your own place, you know, from a thematic level, from a metaphorical level, but also just from a physical level of these toys and kind of what the future bodes for them. It's really bold and really daring just for the sequels to go in the general direction that they went and to have kind of the forward thinking nature of like, okay, well, what is going to happen when these kids grow up, and just tackling that every step of the way and kind of never losing focus of that. Because that was always a thing that notices. I'm like, I didn't even know that Toy Story had a sequel until like years later. And then I would like just watch that DVD nonstop because it just felt bigger. It felt more grandiose, but it felt like the natural direction. And even by that point, I was starting to understand. It's like, oh, I'm not going to play with even at that, I still love playing with my toys, but I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to play with my toys forever. And what's going to happen to them when that happens? And 2 and 3, I think, did such a phenomenal job of just continuing with that overall theme, but also kind of just like pegging that back at us and kind of just like reflecting and showing that's like, yeah, everything changes with time. And, you know, people do not stay the same forever. And what's interesting too, specifically about the antagonists that they introduce in the subsequent sequels, because if you think about it, it's funny because the first movie is the only movie I would say without a direct toy antagonist. Woody's direct antagonist is Buzz, and obviously the exterior tertiary antagonist, if you will, is Sid, who obviously comes in and becomes a larger problem. But the interesting thing to me about Stinky Pete the Prospector and later Lotso Huggin' Bear, and even to an extent the Gabby Gabby doll in Toy Story 4, is that they're all kind of like differentiated variations of like what Woody and Buzz and the rest of the toys could become if they're abandoned by their owners, if they never feel the love of that child, if they never kind of feel that sense of purpose that they know they are, and so they're forced to find it in a different way. It's really kind of reflective and also kind of scary. And it's just like that's the biggest thing that I noticed, just not just with these movies, but with a lot of the Pixar movies that I've gone back and rewatched. I'm like, shit, this shit hits deep. Like when they're literally going into the Dante's Inferno at the end of 3, and they're literally just embracing the fact that, okay, this is it. This is how it goes out. And we're just like, well, I think that's part of the reason why it hit so many people at that time, because not just because they weren't expecting such a very, very large use of just visual imagery, but also just they're like, whoa, I'm not ready to ask those types of questions. This coming from adults too, not just little kids who, again, I was 13 when I watched it, and I'm like, well, this feels a little bit more mature than kind of what I'm used to overall.
Yeah, no, I feel like it's because they kind of disobeyed the classic Hollywood timetable to put a sequel out. I mean, I guess so did maybe Terminator, but it's just kind of like, normally it's like movie comes out 3 years later, second movie comes out, maybe 3 years rather, roughly. Third movie comes out. I'm thinking The Hobbit right now. I'm thinking Lord of the Rings, although that's an odd case because they shot the Lord of the Rings all at once. But you know what I mean? The way that they space them and put them out. Sometimes things get rushed, and the creative process, I think, needs to be cultivated, and it needs to come to you in some cases. And I feel like that's what made the magic of the first one so successful. And I also think that's what made the 2 sequels afterwards in the trilogy, right, be so impactful and resonate with not only the kids who grew up with it, who are now older kids who are, from my generation, right? When the third one came around, it was like high school, man. I was like, I had sports practice. There was like, I was going to shows on the weekend. Obviously, girls were a big thing and they weren't in the Toy Story films, but like the fact that I could watch that and still get something out of it. Again, it's that hotspot that I come back to, that magic of Pixar, which I really don't know what's going on in this modern decade. But I think if you're kind of trying to figure out how they could have such successful sequels that not only kind of defy the initial feel of the first one by, like you said, getting more bigger and more grandiose and having these kind of intense moments, but doing them better, I think, because they just eased into it. It's like, it's ironic that, growing up with these films, it seems like the creators' tact and the creators' sort of abilities grew with our age. And I think that's kind of why I'm not going to watch the fourth one. It's just so hard to, though, with only having seen this amazing trilogy. But I think it's kind of why there's always that thing in the back of my head where it's like, I know I have to see it at some point in time, because like, what are they going to do next to wow me? Right. And I think that speaks to the company and the writing and all that stuff.
It's interesting because just for whatever, Joe, whatever.
Joe?
I'm never gonna get a break from you, but whatever.
Hope you're doing good, bro.
It's interesting because obviously just for how they were able to improve just from the scale alone, that's just a budget thing overall, and just with how the technology improved. And it's interesting that you mentioned the idea of like why it took so long for them to get 3 out, because trust me, there were ideas for Toy Story 3 circulating as early as 2004 when The Incredibles came out, but they were trying to sublet out to a cheaper animation company, and the ideas that were floated around were wild, but just terrible, just some really, really dumb ideas. And I'm glad that they took their time with it, because by the time that they were able to kind of get 3 going, they'd already had a lot, just the run. Okay, just forget the 90s. Take the 2000s run. The 2000s run that Pixar has: Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, Incredibles, Cars, Ratatouille, WALL-E, and Up. 5 out of those movies are Best Animated Feature winners and are nominated for Best Original Screenplay. All of those movies are box office successes. I'm pretty sure each one subsequently topped the rest. Primarily the same writers on most of them, although they started to bring in other talent. Like I said, Brad Bird with The Incredibles, for The Incredibles and Ratatouille. Then obviously Tom McCarthy with Up, and they started to sublet out and bring in other creators. But with Toy Story 3, they brought back the original team. They brought in Michael Arndt, the screenwriter of Little Miss Sunshine, in order to write that, and that was just what it was. But you're right, absolutely, about just how the movies just kind of were able to improve with and kind of mature with their audience, and kind of it was very, very zeitgeisty each time, but the fact that they were able to hit it each time. And again, why I don't want to discredit 4, because as problematic and just overall unnecessary as 4 is, they're still able to get like a lot of good, like there's a lot of just kind of good stuff in it, which is where it's
it's kind of funny. We always joke about like the algorithm gods, right? These guys tapped into the algorithm. and it was in there, and it favored them. Very zeitgeist.
I just saw your comment on Joe's hashtag, and I'm like, oh wow, I missed that.
It is.
Completely.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah.
It's good to have Joe in the chat.
Yeah, definitely. So, unfortunately, before we get out of here and wrap this up, there is one last unfortunate bit of thing that I did have to bring up, which is John Lasseter himself. He's a guy whose names I dropped multiple times on this podcast. What's it called? Obviously, the CEO, head honcho of Disney, was hand-selected by Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg at the time, basically to head the studio, was responsible for picking all the guys, Pete Docter, Andrew Stanton, Joe Ranft, Leon Crick, who was around from the beginning, all those guys that, what's it called? They're legends. Obviously, they kickstarted an animation studio that would go on to influence just the future of the format and the movement in general for the next 2 decades. Unfortunately, so it is obviously well known that in November of 2017, Lasseter, height of the Me Too movement, Lasseter took a leave of absence from Pixar after acknowledging allegations of workplace sexual misconduct, including grabbing, kissing, and comments about physical attributes. He officially left Disney in summer of 2018 and is now working someplace else in the animation industry. And unfortunately, the unfortunate thing about this is that it became so well known that Pixar actually had minders tasked with reining in his impulses. It is unfortunately important to bring this up because while I don't want to harp on it, it's just difficult, obviously, just with the balancing out of kind of just, these creators whose work that we love and just what they are actually like as people. And but it's important to bring it up because he is an extremely important figure just in the history of the company, and his work is so influential, and it cannot be stated just how important it was and just how influential it was, but also it can't go unacknowledged is the problem. So that's kind of just like the one last bit that I do have to bring up. But hey, hopefully it will just mean that Pixar could just get better with time after, for the most part, a largely disappointing decade. I'm hoping that Soul can kind of breathe new. I'm not even going to go there with that, just obvious visual idiom, but can just breathe more soul into Pixar going forward. And screw it, I just did it.
They need to pick me up for sure.
Yeah, because Soul looks amazing, and it's definitely going to be interesting to say the least when you see that competing with Wonder Woman 84 head to head on streaming services Christmas Day. Don't worry, that actually will be a topic for a later podcast because that alone, there's too much to talk about. But
I'm
Chris,
stoked on that 1-2 punch, man. Can't wait to get into some good stuff.
That's going to be an interesting way to wrap up the year, to say the least, just as far as where the future of cinema bodes. But Chris, we did it. We finished it. It's it's funny. This is technically called the Toy Story podcast. I think this ended up being a little bit more of the Pixar podcast, but you know what? I'm okay with it because Pixar's great. They've made some of the greatest movies ever, just in my opinion, animation or just in general. And I can't wait to. And there's a reason why, even through their worst, I'll still show up to them every single time. And
same.
Yeah. So with that being said,
what more can you say?
Yeah, there's literally nothing else I can say. I've already made the argument like multiple times of how this is.
I'm not disagreeing. So, I'd be a fool to disagree. I would have to say.
Oh, come on. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like as you said multiple times, there's plenty that we disagree on. But
this is one of those exceptions to every rule, right?
Yeah.
You've been trying to hit that segue on the outro for a minute now, so I'll let you.
I see what you did there. But people, thank you once again for tuning in words to another episode of the Talkin TV podcast. We have new content that we put out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. This was the latest in a series of live podcasts that we've been giving directly to you, the people, on Monday nights. The audio will officially go up on Wednesday, which is when I will also be putting out another piece of Pixar content the day before Thanksgiving. Little treat for you guys. I've officially done it. I've sold out. I'm a shill.
You've sold out.
I've sold out. I'm remaking my own video. I'm pulling a Michael Haneke and I'm remaking my own video, my old top 10 Pixar movies from the old Movie Nerd Reviews channel. I'm officially remaking it. I am doing my top 10 Pixar movies Redux. That will be on the channel on Wednesday. And Friday, also tune into the next episode of Mando Watch. We're halfway through the season. I still can't believe that we already are. And we've got new episodes of that coming out every Friday, covering the new episodes of The Mandalorian as they drop on Disney+.
Yeah, and also right here, if you could see on my screen, go rewatch me watching Toy Story 3 for the first time.
That was a magical moment. Like, it's so funny because it's still like, just from a watch log standpoint, it didn't necessarily do what we would have hoped, but that was just such a great movie that it was just so well worth it overall. But sure. And also, guys, if you see Chris, pull that back up. I want to show Pull that back up. I want to show the new banner. Chris Chris did the excellent job of making a new banner. I mean, look at that. Look at that. It literally looks like a rising sun. I feel like I'm looking at Apocalypse Now with that. Like, look at how good that shit looks. But
Thanks,
people,
man.
guess what? If you can, obviously not that button where it says to click subscribe, but if you can click on the subscribe button on that channel and then click the little bell next to the subscribe button, you can get notified every time we put up new content. Like I said, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And also be sure to follow us on our social media profiles, Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV Podcast. No G, spelled exactly like you see it, both there and there. And Chris, you have anything else you want to give the people before we get out of here?
I mean, guys, the community is growing. You guys are
quite literally
really being awesome. I mean, 131 subscribers and counting. And, you know, hey, season 3 is just around the corner. And boy, oh boy, do we have bigger things planned than we've already done. So.
12 seasons and a short film. I remember the slogan.
Yeah.
I feel like you got to put that on the banner now. Just 12 seasons.
Oh, that'll be on the t-shirts and all that. Oh, that's hilarious. Okay, I do have to put that on the banner. That is a great call.
I think that you came up with. Well, I mean, you did.
Talkin TV, 12 seasons and a short film. Phenomenal. I love it, Dom. This is a great chat, man. I had a good time.
Yeah, me too. Watch more fucking movies, people. We out. We'll see you soon.
Bye.